When Forspoken releases on October 11th for the PS5 and PC, you can add it to the long list of open-world games to play in 2022. But will this latest action RPG from Square Enix set itself apart? Should you check it out? Well, are you a fan of high fantasy, story-driven experiences? And do you like tinkering with magic, whether in combat or while zipping across vast and varied landscapes? If so, then I think Forspoken is absolutely worth keeping on your radar. But what do we actually know about the game? Turns out, a lot. I poured through every article, Twitter feed, and YouTube video I could find, and I put everything I learned in this video. Just how open will the world be, and what will you discover? What spells will you cast, and what enemies will you encounter? If you want answers to these questions and more, then I hope you'll join me for my ultimate preview of Forspoken. Before we begin, I want to thank NordVPN for sponsoring this video. To get a huge discount on a 2-year plan plus 1 month free, stick around till the middle of the video for a special offer, or click the link in the description below. But for now, let's get into it. If you don't know, Forspoken is being developed by Luminous Productions, a Square Enix studio composed largely of developers who worked previously on Final Fantasy XV. But don't expect their latest effort to play out like a Final Fantasy game. With Forspoken, Luminous set out to create something with a broader appeal than even Final Fantasy, and that started with hiring writers from outside the traditional JRPG wheelhouse. For the story concept, they hired Gary Whitta, who co-wrote Star Wars Rogue One, and Amy Hennig, who served for years as lead writer on Uncharted. As such, the story of Forspoken, and perhaps not coincidentally the entire game, seems to play out a lot more like a Western action RPG than what you might expect from a team of developers known for working on one of the world's most popular JRPGs. Anyhow, the story begins in New York City, where you take the role of Frey Holland, a 20-year-old orphan who's found herself in trouble with the law. That said, she does have a super cute cat, whose name is Homer, so things aren't all bad. But Frey is nonetheless hoping for a change, and well, that's what she gets when she's somehow transported from New York to the fantastical world of Athia. How or why this happens, we don't know, but we do know that once in Athia, Frey is able to use magical combat and traversal powers. More on those later. Despite these powers and the fact that Athia has 0 warrants out for Frey's arrest, she still wants nothing more than to go home. After all, everything in Athia wants to kill her, and it's been overtaken by a mysterious phenomenon known as the Break, which takes the form of a poisonous and nearly inescapable fog that shrouds the land and either kills or mutates any living thing it touches. Well, any living thing except Frey. She's immune to the Break for reasons that we don't know, but this rare immunity prompts some Athians to hail her as the world's savior. Even with the knowledge that she might be able to save this world, Frey would still rather return to New York than risk becoming dragon food. But according to the PlayStation blog, that's just not an option, as apparently getting back to Earth will require Frey to defeat a group of villains known as the Tantas. These are powerful figures that once served as Athia's kind and benevolent rulers, but have now gone mad thanks to the Break, and they're now using their power to spread destruction and chaos. It's fair to assume that the Tantas are Forspoken's main antagonists, and based on that article on the PlayStation blog, we know they'll be featured as, quote, major boss characters. But we don't know how many you'll encounter. That said, each Tanta will be themed after a different virtue, and so far we've learned of 2. First is Tanta Prav. Representing the virtue of justice, Prav once fairly and justly presided over Athia's judicial system, but has now become ruthless and vengeful. Next is Tanta Sila, who represents the virtue of strength. Rather than use her strength to protect Athia as she once did, she now uses it to destroy anyone who stands in her way. We also know Tantas is the most powerful of all the Tantas, so she might be Forspoken's main villain. Additionally, Game Informer's Forspoken cover story said the Tantas, quote, govern Athia's different regions, which makes it sound like you'll have to defeat one Tanta for every region of the map. Again, how many that might be, we don't know, but a preview on Polygon.com did say Frey's main objective will be to cleanse Athia of the break and dispel of the corrupted matriarchs who rule it. So yeah, we're starting to get at least a vague idea of what Frey will need to do if she wants to get back to Homer the Cat. Thankfully, she does have some help. One of the first characters Frey meets in Athia is a sentient, talking bracelet named Cuff. Similar to sidekicks in other games, albeit perhaps a bit more inanimate, Cuff acts as a guide for Frey as she embarks on her journey through this strange new world. It sounds like he'll deliver hints should you get lost, shout a heads up in combat when incoming attacks are imminent, and it's been revealed that Cuff will also allow players to scan the environment for items and crafting materials. Now, from the early previews of Forspoken, we saw, or rather heard, that both Cuff and Frey are not only pretty sarcastic, but very chatty. And one frequent criticism was that their banter was so frequent that it became, well, annoying. Thankfully, Forspoken producer Ryo Mitsuno has gone on record saying that Luminous is not only listening, but also making adjustments. I don't know about you, but I don't want to hear the same quips over and over, nor do I want to have Cuff hold my hand throughout the game. Hopefully Luminous finds a good balance between fun banter and leaving the player alone as they explore the world. And speaking of... we don't know how big Athia is going to be, and as I've said, we don't know how many regions you'll explore. But we do know quite a few details. Let's start by looking at the first of 3 regions we do know anything about. It's a makeshift city called Sepal that will not only function as your home base, it's actually where any remaining Athians are now forced to call home. That's because it's the only place outside of the break's influence due to its high elevation. We also know it's pretty sizable. Multiple previews have put its population into the tens of thousands. Anyhow, you'll take frequent respite here, and I'd presume it's also here that you'll pick up the majority of your quests, hit up shops if you need an item or two, and talk to NPCs if you want to learn about the world. According to Mitsuno, it's in Sepal that Frey is, quote, going to meet a lot of people, get to know them, get to know their backstory, what they're about, what their lives used to be, why the world is in the state that it's in, end quote. Now, as I said, this is the only area in all of Athia where humans can remain unaffected by the break. And this begs the question, just how empty or lonely will the rest of Athia, the part of it that you'll actually spend the majority of your time exploring, feel? According to a preview by Eurogamer, it's, quote, best to assume there isn't a single friendly being out there. However, this wouldn't be the first open world to be mostly void of NPCs. Take Elden Ring. The Lands Between does feature an NPC here and there, but it thrives on a feeling of solitude. But if that's not your thing, that might be why Luminous insisted on Cuff offering such frequent commentary. Just don't expect to make frequent conversation with anybody else outside Sepal. As for the rest of Athia, just how open will it be? This is definitely a proper open world game, no doubt about that. But will you be able to go anywhere right from the start? I don't think so. In an interview with MinMax, Forspoken level designer Dan Callan was asked directly how open the world of Athia will feel in comparison to Breath of the Wild. Callan basically responded that Forspoken is a more story-driven experience than Breath of the Wild, which meant they couldn't make it quite as open. Quote, when you're trying to make a more story-driven game, like, you have to have those beats that you hit. You have to have those gating points that say, okay, we're delivering this piece of the narrative here, which explains the context of this next thing over here. He elaborated on this in relation to Zelda by saying, quote, Breath of the Wild had the benefit of saying it's a more freeform experience and you can take it on in any order you want. But I hear a criticism of that game is like, yeah, the narrative wasn't as strong. Now, if that doesn't convince you that Forspoken will be less open than games like Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring, Forspoken co-director Takeshi Terada has also said, quote, "As you progress, the story widens out to open up more areas and stuff to do within those areas." End quote. Again, it sounds like your level of freedom will increase as you progress through the story. However, going back to the Callan interview, he did mention regarding the moment-to-moment exploration, Forspoken does manage to hit a level of freedom that compares to Breath of the Wild. Quote, "The mobility systems are great. We call it magic parkour, and just the traversal feels unlike anything else out there. I think the freedom of movement you have to climb and swing and do those kinds of cool Breath of the Wild exploratory things, I think it's there." End quote. Now, I have a whole section later where I talk about how magic parkour will actually work, but for now, just know that Frey will basically be able to climb, or rather parkour her way up just about any surface. Okay, back to the world itself. Other than Sepal, what other areas will you explore? We know of at least two. The first is called Preynost. I hope I'm saying that right. This is the desert area we saw in the early trailers and the previews from late 2021. But if you're hoping for a more colorful environment, we also know of another region called Avawalit. This is a forest biome doused in blues and greens where you'll find dense foliage kept lush thanks to rivers and ponds found at the base of even more rocky cliffs. Yep, between the desert and the forest environments, it seems like the developers focused on creating some serious verticality everywhere you look in Athia. Now, one thing we know about Avawalit is that it's ruled by Tanta Prav, again the Tanta of Justice. But other than that, Luminous just hasn't shared many details about these specific regions. That said, we do know a bit about the individual activities you'll partake in as you explore. This includes, of course, side quests. As for the main quest, all we really know are the story details I've already covered. But when it comes to optional quests, Game Informer said specifically that they'll mostly focus on two big aspects, the places and the people. Thankfully, Terada elaborated on both. When it comes to quests that focus on people, he said there's obviously a lot of people who have died or suffered because of the circumstances within the story. By talking to the NPCs and finding out more about what they're going through, you'll be able to achieve an understanding of more of the sub-story. So it sounds like you'll learn about Athia by helping people work through their struggles. As for side quests that focus on places, Terada had this to say. On the map, you can see buildings that used to be there or things that used to exist, but that have fallen. You can use the map to go back and figure out what happened to this land and the history behind this world. To me, that sounds pretty intriguing, and we actually know quite a bit about some of these places you'll discover. I don't know how many of these will be tied to bespoke side quests, but it sounds like some of the locations I'm about to mention at the very least provide more templated side activities. Let's start with refuges. These are smaller locations scattered across Athia where Frey can rest, craft, and learn. One mentioned in Game Informer's preview coverage was called the Water Garden, and it was described as a rundown building themed after medieval and Renaissance-era architecture. Refuges will not only provide respite from the break, they'll serve as fast travel locations, and at least some of them will feature a workbench where Frey can upgrade her gear and craft new items. More on gear later, but as for crafting, Terada has said, quote, "There are two main things you can do with crafting. The first is just making items for healing and recovery, and the second is to add strength or additional abilities to your gear or accessories." Anyhow, it's also in refuges that Frey can read notes and manuscripts, and this is at least one way to reveal points of interest on your map. As put by Game Informer, quote, "Probably the most intriguing data gleaned from the refuge's manuscripts are the locations of various other shelters in the nearby area, all of which are automatically populated on the player's map so Frey can venture out to find them later." End quote. Now, whether this involves actual reading on the part of the player, I'm not sure, but this mechanic of finding manuscripts, which then reveal points of interest, sounds like a bit of a middle ground between, say, traditional open-world games, which often populate maps automatically with dozens of icons at once, and something like Elden Ring, which requires you to literally visit each point of interest one by one before they appear on your map. Based on the short glimpse we've gotten of Forspoken's map, it didn't seem like an overwhelming mess of icons, though this could have just been an early game glimpse of what the map looks like before you take on a bunch of quests. And one menu we haven't seen is the Journal tab, which is likely where your quests will populate. Hopefully this doesn't get too messy either. Getting back to the specific locations you'll visit, we've also heard about what are called Lutetia guilds. These sound similar to refuges, but much larger and more dangerous. The one mentioned in the Game Informer preview was described as a multi-story tower marked on Frey's map by a tower icon. Lutetia guilds once served as places of study for scholars, and as such, they're packed with even more Athian history and lore, and similar to how refuges work, investigating this lore will reveal even more points of interest on your map. However, unlike refuges, Lutetia guilds are not safe from the break. Expect combat and maybe exploration-based challenges. And speaking of exploration, does Forspoken have anything that resembles dungeons? Well, yes. We haven't heard anything about main story dungeons, but we have heard about what are called Seats of Reflection. These are challenging mini-dungeons spread across Athia. One shown in a hands-off demo was described as a subterranean labyrinth, and it was apparently filled with at least one horde of enemies. Whether working your way through Seats of Reflection will involve puzzles or anything other than fighting, we don't know, but it does sound like these dungeons will culminate in a boss or mini-boss encounter. Next, we have what are called monuments. These sound like huge stone monoliths that you can discover, and according to one Game Informer article, quote, tracking them down and clearing them of the break allows these structures to regain their original form and helps Frey get a power-up. It's also been mentioned that each Tanta has their own monument, and the power-up Frey receives at each monument will be associated with that Tanta. For example, the monument associated with the Tanta of Strength bestowed Frey with 5 points to her defense stat. Another type of location you'll run across are villages. These are of course abandoned because of the break, and they've now been overtaken by enemies, which you'll be rewarded for clearing out. Overall, it sounds like a lot of these side activities involves fighting or clearing out enemies. And that's one big concern I have with Forspoken. I hope there's more variety in terms of the side content. In fact, the next side activity seems to involve even more fighting, more clearing out groups of enemies. These are called breakstorms. According again to Game Informer, breakstorms are a, quote, influx of fog that sweeps through the land, swallowing anything in its path. If Frey gets swept into the phenomenon, she'll face hordes of incredibly difficult enemies, end quote. Now, thankfully, this seems to be where enemies get really interesting. It was apparently inside a breakstorm where Frey took on this incredible-looking monster called a Jabberwock. Now, the fog that makes up the break grows thick within breakstorms, but there are other locations in Athia that are doused in an even thicker layer of the destructive mist, and these look to be a particular standout when it comes to not just combat, but also exploration. They're called Depths of Corruption. And according to Mitsuno, they're at the, quote, really deep end of the break in each realm. And Game Informer went even further to describe that you'll have to find a specific entrance and literally jump in. Quote, Frey stands in a landscape that looks made of fog. There's a pit at its center, and the player is prompted to jump in. Following the command, Frey appears as though she's plunged into a deep body of water, and at the bottom is a surreal land where enemies provide plenty of challenge. And when they say surreal, they mean it. The area we see here is apparently called a sideways city. Everything appears to have been twisted, making it feel almost like another dimension. Luminous hasn't said what your exact objective will be once you're inside a depth of corruption, but these scenes make it look like they'll be very fun to explore, especially with your parkour abilities. And that brings me to my next topic. One of the most immediately alluring aspects of Forspoken's gameplay is no doubt the fast-paced and fluid traversal. Again, the developers call it magic parkour, and it's easy to see why. Frey will be leaping, gliding, springing, and even surfing through the environment in a way that looks more like a choreographed dance than any traditional means of getting around. However, it appears that Frey's parkour abilities might not be available from the get-go. as they are apparently part of the game's various skill trees. I elaborate on the skill trees later, but for now know that you will have to unlock and upgrade at least some, if not all, of Frey's parkour moves. For example, here we see an ability called Flow, whereby holding down the circle button enables high-speed movement and parkour. If you ask me, it sounds like this might be Frey's most basic parkour ability. As for more specialized moves, one we've heard of is called Zip. Apparently, many rocky surfaces will feature anchor points, and Frey can use the Zip ability to latch onto and dash between them. That might be what we see here, or this could be an entirely separate ability. I'm not sure. And as I mentioned earlier, you can eventually unlock what can only be described as a magic surfboard. This is interesting because with jet skis obviously not being a thing in Athia, it's cool that Luminous has designed a way to skim across large bodies of water. And on a side note, this does beg the question, will Frey be able to swim? Will the game feature any underwater areas? We'll have to wait and see. Some other abilities we've seen include this triple jump and this levitation ability. The levitation skill will be particularly handy because, as revealed in several previews, fall damage is a thing in Forspoken. If you leap off a cliff or fall off accidentally, this could save your life. But that brings up one big catch to magic parkour in Forspoken. See that series of small diamonds at the bottom left of the UI? That's actually a stamina meter, and if you look carefully, you can see it depletes whenever Frey uses a magic parkour ability. So if you want to hover and break your fall, or use your surfboard to glide across a vast body of water, just make sure you have enough stamina to do so. Thankfully, this gauge is upgradable. Here we see it has 3 diamonds, and in other clips, which presumably take place later in the game, it has 5. Also, from what I can tell, this gauge does seem to limit only magic parkour. Combat-related spells don't seem to use up your stamina. That said, you will be using parkour abilities in combat. In fact, based on the clips we've seen, I'd say you might be using your magic parkour on the battlefield just as much as you use it to get around. That goes for whether you're using a dash to dodge an enemy attack or some jumping maneuver to gain the high ground. In any case, this brings me to what I think might be the most impressive aspect of Forspoken. One of the most interesting details about Forspoken is that the combat is entirely magic-based. To put it another way, there are no traditional weapons in the game. No swords, no axes, no flails, and no bows and arrows. Instead, Frey has a vast, and I do mean vast, array of spells she can use to dish out damage. Now, it's worth noting that some spells do resemble traditional weapons, such as this flame sword. So for players hoping for a melee fix or for combat situations that require you to get up close and personal, these will likely be the way to go. But it's definitely a bold move on the part of Luminous Productions to go with a 100% magic-based combat system. So what sorts of magic are we talking about? Well, in addition to both short and long-ranged attacks, it looks like Frey's arsenal is ultimately divided into 3 categories: attack spells, support spells, and a third category which I don't think Luminous has named just yet, but they make up the most powerful spells in the game. From here on, I'll call them super spells. All 3 spell categories are represented in this triangle at the bottom right of the screen. The circle at the bottom left represents whatever support spell you have active. The bottom right circle represents your active attack spell, and the circle at the apex represents your active super spell. Support and attack spells are executed by pressing L2 and R2 respectively, while your active super spell is cast by pressing both at the same time. Now you might be asking, does this mean you're always limited to just 3 spells? Nope. According to Game Informer, quote, "At any given time you have access to your entire magic arsenal, meaning there's no limit to how many abilities you can equip at once. To easily swap between your various abilities, the L1 and R1 buttons bring up a ring menu, slowing the battle to give you time to figure out which spell you want to use." End quote. Okay, so that's convenient. But one thing I want to mention is that in this gameplay footage here, we see what appears to be the player swapping between spells without using the radial menu. So I wonder if the radial menu is more for equipping active spells, while you'll then be able to more quickly switch between your active spells with the press of a button. Just something that popped into my head as I was reviewing the footage. In any case, it seems this system, in one way or another, does let you customize your spell loadout. It looks like you'll be able to select different spells depending on what works best for you and which spells might work best against specific enemies. So that's the combat UI and the basic spell categorization. But it appears that spells even within those three categories, attack, support, and the more powerful spells, are also categorized into 4 colors: red, green, blue, and purple. Now, I'm doing a little guesswork here, but I think these colors represent different elements. It seems that red represents fire magic and blue represents water, but I'm not entirely sure what green and purple represent. Or I could be completely wrong and these colors might represent something else entirely. But I find this unlikely, given how we see the color inside this triangle change as Frey uses different elemental spells. Plus, in an interview with PressStart.com, Terada confirmed that certain enemies will have elemental strengths and weaknesses. He said with the quote, "massive amounts of magic to choose from, we wanted to give players ways to think about them and how they use them in the game. So there are elements and elemental affinities alongside an elemental weakness system in the game." Okay, let's finally look at some of the individual spells, starting with a few of your attack spells. You have your basic projectiles, one of which is simply called Shot. While some spells have a cooldown, Shot and other more basic spells will not. As such, it does minimal damage, but with no cooldown, it basically has infinite ammo. Next is Slice. This is the fire sword I mentioned earlier, great for dealing melee damage. And if ranged combat is more your thing, there's Blast Slice, which lets you impale enemies with a fire spear that then explodes. Fan Bolt, which fires a horizontal spray of projectiles, great for targeting multiple enemies side by side. And Cluster Bolt, which I don't think we've seen, but apparently fires an arrow into the sky that then breaks apart and rains back down on enemies. Other attack spells include Dart, which is another basic projectile, and Pulse Dart, which is similar but lets you charge the attack to deal more damage. Let's now look at some of the support magic, which seems focused on spells that hinder or freeze enemies, spells that shield Frey from damage, and other AoE-based spells. As for healing, this seems to be reserved for potions, which we see represented by this icon here next to what I believe is Frey's health meter. Anyhow, one support spell that slows your enemies is Bind, which literally binds your opponents in a tangled web of vines and roots. You can also set traps. For example, a support spell called Prime lets you lay explosive mines on the battlefield. Other spells include Crucible, which apparently buffs Frey's attack power, and Distortion, which shrouds enemies in some form of harmful or limiting fog. Two fire-based support spells include Fusillade, which summons a group of flaming blades that can apparently block incoming attacks, and then Legion, which we see here, and allows Frey to summon a group of flaming soldiers to fight for her. Okay, so what about your more powerful super spells? Again, I don't know if that's what they're called, but since Luminous hasn't named them, I have to call them something. Anyhow, as you'd expect, these are pretty spectacular. There's Conflagration, where Frey causes this violent wall of lava to erupt through the ground. Then there's Cataract, which causes these icy spikes of earth to explode from the battlefield. And here we see Tempest, which looks like a lightning-based attack and, for my money, is one of the most beautiful things shown in all of the Forspoken gameplay we've seen thus far. Just keep in mind that these more powerful spells do have a significantly longer cooldown. Now, I don't have time to cover all the spells we've seen thus far, but 3 more that I think are noteworthy include Tendril, which lets you lash out with this whip, and this huge bubble of water. This one's interesting because, like the Bind spell I showed earlier, it seems to trap opponents. And this makes me wonder if you can combo it with other spells while your enemies are trapped to deal more damage. Given how many varied spells are at your disposal, one of the things I'm most looking forward to is how you'll be able to, hopefully, combo different attacks together to create different effects. It really is impressive how many different spells we've seen in the previews so far. As for other combat mechanics, we know you can stagger enemies, opening them up for an additional attack, and apparently you can also gain some sort of advantage or maybe deal a burst of extra damage by sneaking in a first strike. Also, this description of a perk provided by a piece of gear seems to indicate that Cuff will be able to help Frey block certain attacks. Finally, there's one more type of magic in Forspoken that probably fits within the support category, but might actually help avoid enemies altogether. I'm referring, of course, to stealth. One ability lets Frey go invisible, and in a preview posted by Eurogamer, it was mentioned that another ability will allow Frey to cast a clone of herself to distract enemies. Now, this clone could be used in combat, but I'm hopeful it might also be good for distracting enemies so you can sneak past them or sneak up behind them. So yeah, as I said, there's a ton of magic in Forspoken. But who, or rather what, will you be using these spells against? Well, let's take a look at the enemies. But before we do, I want to mention that bad guys don't just exist in video games. Data thieves are sadly a real thing, and that's why I want to share what is honestly a great offer from NordVPN. If you're not already using a VPN, connecting to a virtual private network masks your location and your IP address to keep threats from identifying you or sneaking around your data. It's a simple way to protect yourself from hackers, online identity thieves, or even just pesky advertisers. What's more, ZDNet and Laptop Mag ranked NordVPN as the best VPN for gaming in 2022, and GamesRadar, TechRadar, and IGN all placed it on their lists of the top VPNs of the year. NordVPN also lets you quickly and easily connect to servers in different countries, which, pro tip, lets you buy games for cheap when they go on sale in another region. I use NordVPN to protect myself online, and at the time I'm posting this video, they're offering my viewers over 60% off a 2-year plan plus 1 month free. That's over 60% off, 1 month free, and you get 2 years peace of mind. This offer isn't permanent, so if you're interested, visit nordvpn.com/questmode, or click the link in the description and the pinned comment of this video. Just make sure to use the coupon code QuestMode. That's QuestMode, all one word. Okay, back to the video. First off, let's talk about the basic human, or rather, ex-human enemies. In Forspoken, they're known as break zombies. First off, I want to thank Square Enix for just acknowledging that yes, they're zombies. Anyhow, I'm guessing these will often show up in groups and make for some of the easier foes in Athia. Then there are animals, which have also been mutated or zombified. Now, one important detail is that based on several previews, we know that mutated enemies will vary in difficulty based on their level of corruption. In fact, there are 3 levels of break corruption. The deeper into the fog you go, the more corrupt enemies become. And more corrupted enemies will not only be more difficult, they'll look more grotesque, and they'll be covered in more of this metallic gloss. Remember those break storms and depths of corruption I mentioned earlier? Yeah, that's where you can expect to meet some of the most deeply corrupted foes. But enemies in the world of Athia aren't limited to former humans and animals. Some look straight up demonic. I've already mentioned the Jabberwock, which looks spectacular. But then we've seen this guy, known as a Giga. And of course, we've seen dragons. Ultimately, the more imaginative enemy designs like the Jabberwock and the Giga make me really excited to see what other terrifying bad guys, particularly bosses, Frey might face off against. And speaking of bosses, there are the Tantas. Now, I covered them at length in the beginning of this video, but I think it's important to reiterate that it sounds like you'll have to defeat at least one Tanta per region of the map. And one detail I didn't cover earlier is that we know each Tanta will have unique elemental abilities. For example, Tanta Prov will harness the power of water and gravity. It's also been revealed that each Tanta will have minions themed after their specific virtue. For example, Tanta Prav, the Tanta of Justice, will have fighters called Unjust Enforcers. I don't think we've seen these in any of the gameplay footage, but going back again to the Game Informer cover story, Unjust Enforcers were described as minions that, quote, fight in groups, put up strong barriers, and use ranged attacks to keep you as far away as possible, end quote. And then there's a mini-boss themed after Tanta Prav called the Pitiless Arbiter, who we see here and is obviously rocking the Justice theme pretty hard. One cool detail here is that apparently if you keep an eye on her scales, they'll glow blue when she's gearing up for her next attack. I don't know if you'll encounter multiple Pitiless Arbiters or if this is just a one-off mini-boss, but I think it's a fair bet that you'll meet other mini-bosses themed after the other Tantas. And along the way, you'll likely want to build up your character. So let's look at how you'll upgrade Frey's gear, spells, and abilities. At its heart, Forspoken is an action RPG, and with that comes a number of systems that allow you to level up and customize your character. First off, per most RPGs, you'll gain experience for defeating enemies and completing certain open-world activities. As for the individual customization systems, they include magic and gear customization, and a third option that's unlike anything I've ever seen in a video game. But more on that later. Let's start with magic. In addition to experience, you'll also earn mana for defeating enemies and completing certain open-world tasks. It's here in the Magic tab where you'll then spend mana to unlock and level up certain spells in the game's multiple skill trees. Now, some spells are unlocked through story progression, but most, from what I can tell, are unlocked here. And I'm not 100% certain, but I believe spells within a diamond shape are your magic parkour abilities, while spells in a circle are your combat abilities. And one important note here is that some spells are one-offs. You unlock them and that's it. No leveling up. But others can be leveled up, like Burst Shot, which as we see here can be increased to level 3. Also, as indicated by the subtle webbing between nodes, abilities do seem to be connected in a particular sequence, which indicates to me that you can't just unlock them in any order. And finally, this is just one of several skill trees. There will be others, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, there's an option to switch between them. Okay, so what about upgrading your gear? Well, first off, gear in Forspoken is split into two types, cloaks and necklaces. According to one preview, cloaks give Frey significant attack and defensive boosts, but based on the footage we've seen, so do necklaces. In fact, aside from the obvious cosmetic differences, I'm not sure how necklaces and cloaks differ from one another. Do cloaks provide more powerful perks, or do the perks focus on different types of magic? Here, one cloak grants Frey immunity to poison, and another seems to provide faster recovery from debuffs. And another causes something called surge magic to recharge faster when blocking attacks. One side note here is the mention of surge magic. This might be referring to what I've been calling super spells, but that's just a guess. Anyhow, when it comes to necklaces, all we've seen is this one called Sarka, which causes your support spells to deal extra damage. So maybe necklaces focus on support magic while cloaks focus on attack and surge magic? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Next, notice that each necklace and cloak has what appears to be several additional upgrade slots. So perhaps you'll be able to unlock additional buffs or maybe even customize each individual piece of gear. Finally, notice that the gear selection screen shows the extent to which you've upgraded several of Frey's stats. You'll be able to increase your health, stamina, defense, and healing. And if you look here, you can see at least some of these stats change depending on what gear you have equipped. And you can see that the different colors of magic at Frey's disposal also build in strength. Okay, let's now look at that third customization option. This one's pretty interesting as it allows you to paint designs on Frey's fingernails that will imbue her with more buffs and gameplay perks. Now, based on several previews, it sounds like fingernail designs will be unlocked by spending particular items that you'll find called break shards. But again, other than that, it's not clear how the perks you'll get from updating your fingernail designs will differ, at least in a broad sense, from the perks you might gain by changing your cloak or your necklace. I mean, why have an entirely separate menu screen for fingernail designs unless there's some major difference in how they affect your character? Hopefully we'll get more clarity soon as to how these perks are distinct and interesting. Okay, before I move on, I do want to mention that there are some other tabs in the menu screen that I haven't mentioned. Those would be the Resources tab, which is probably where you'll find consumables like potions, not to mention items you can use for crafting. And lastly, there's the Archive tab, which I'm guessing is where you'll go to read any lore that you've discovered about Athia. Ultimately, everything we've seen in the game's menu seems to put Forspoken in pretty familiar and traditional action RPG territory. The fingernail cosmetic is interesting, but overall, nothing here seems to break any new ground. That said, there is one aspect of the game that does seem to be pushing the envelope. In that Forspoken won't release on last-generation consoles, it's currently a PS5 and PC exclusive. Forspoken isn't beholden to the restraints of older technology. As such, the developers are hoping to set the bar, at least in terms of graphics, for all future open-world games. And that's not an exaggeration. Luminous studio head and Forspoken director Takeshi Aramaki flat out said, quote, "With Forspoken, we're aiming to achieve the highest quality visuals ever seen in an open world game." That's a bold claim, but the trailers and gameplay demos shown thus far are gorgeous, and Luminous have revealed some details that lend credibility to Aramaki's quote. First off, the game is being developed on Luminous Engine, which was designed specifically to build visually stunning AAA titles. Now, the Luminous Engine was used to build Final Fantasy 15, so what is Forspoken doing that will make it look that much better? Well, the studio is partnering with AMD to bring several enhancements to the game. There's actually a YouTube video that details these technologies, and I'll link to it in the description, but here are the highlights. And as far as I can tell, each of these technologies works on both the PC and the PS5. The first is ray tracing. We know the game will at the very least have ray-traced shadows. Second, the game will utilize something called screen space reflections. From my understanding, this is different from pure ray tracing, but the effect is pretty startling. Here you can see Luminous comparing what Forspoken looks like using their prior technologies as opposed to screen space reflections. Next is something called Fidelity FX Super Resolution, which from what I understand is similar to NVIDIA's DLSS technology. In a nutshell, it efficiently upscales lower-res images to 4K, allowing your PS5 or PC to devote more muscle to simultaneously running the game at 60 frames per second. Now, I've seen conflicting reports on whether Forspoken will actually run in 4K at 60 frames per second. An article on Engadget says the team at Luminous is, quote, aiming to run the game at 2K 60 FPS and 4K 30 FPS with ray tracing. But if the game does manage to hit 60 frames per second at 4K, at least on anything that's not a pretty decent gaming PC, it sounds like Fidelity FX Super Resolution is how it's going to happen. There are other technologies highlighted in AMD's video, but the descriptions get pretty technical, so if you're interested, again, I've left a link in the description. As for one non-graphical technology that's specific to the PS5, we know that the DualSense controller will provide unique feedback for each of the game's magic spells. Ultimately, we'll get to see and feel Forspoken when it releases for PS5 and PC on October 11th. And speaking of the release date, I do want to mention a few release details. First off, I've mentioned that Forspoken is a PlayStation 5 console exclusive. Well, sort of. It's actually a 2-year console exclusive, meaning it could eventually come to Xbox, but not until October of 2024. Lastly, Luminous and Square Enix have actually revealed plans for some story DLC. It's called In Tantas We Trust, and I think all we know is that it serves as a prequel to the main campaign and is scheduled for a winter 2023 release. So there you have it. That's everything I've learned about Forspoken. Did I mention anything you didn't already know, or did I miss anything worth talking about? Let me know in the comments below. And with that, I want to thank you for watching this entire video. If you enjoyed it, well, my channel focuses on previews just like this for the biggest upcoming AAA video games. I've recently posted previews for Gotham Knights, Saints Row, and Hellblade 2, and I plan on covering future games like Starfield, God of War Ragnarok, Hogwarts Legacy, Suicide Squad, and more. So if you're looking forward to those games, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ding the bell icon so you get notified whenever I post. If you want to keep up with me and see what I'm playing, you can follow me on Twitter @QuestModeGames. And finally, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.